David to David, the unlikely anointed king, the youngest of Jesse's son, chosen not for his strength or stature, but for a heart that pulsed with an unwavering trust in God. We witnessed him, a mere shepherd boy, face the giant Goliath, armed not with the tools of war, but with the purity of youth and the courage of faith. His victory was not a testament to his prowess, but rather a vivid illustration of where true power resides, in the Almighty God. David's heart was a beacon of steadfast purity, a man who sought to honor God in every action, perfect not in deed, but in devotion. His triumph over Goliath wasn't merely about defeating a giant, it was a declaration the battle is the Lord's, showing us that in our weakness, God's strength shines brightest. We explored the anchors of this confidence that David had. It was anchored in his past experiences of God's faithfulness, his profound understanding of God's greatness, and his fierce zeal for God's honor. David's trust in the God of Israel led to a monumental victory, yet as we turn the page, we see a stark contrast. Today we'll uncover how quickly life can change for anyone, even for those whose faith in God seems unshakable. Again, the focus this morning is that we'll uncover how quickly life can change for anyone, even for those whose faith in God seems unshakable. David's story shifts dramatically from the roar of crowds celebrating his triumph to him facing the deep depths of despair, feeling as though God's plan for him had suddenly vanished. And this message will navigate through the chapters of David's life as he transitions from a favored giant slayer to a fugitive, revealing his confidence in God's timing as we answer the question, what does it mean to trust in God's schedules when ours is disrupted? That's a difficult thing, right? When we have a set plan and we have some ideas of what things would look like, and then God's plan seems to veer us off course. So what does it look like to be confident in God's timing, to be confident in God's protection? How do we find security in God's shield when we are at our most vulnerable moments? And then finally, we'll see that we can be confident in God's promises. How do we cling to God's promises when their fulfillment seem indefinitely delayed? And so life sometimes has this way of surprising us, doesn't it? I mean, we have this plan and this idea of how we think that God is supposed to orchestrate things. We study God's Word and we see how He's worked in the past, and we assume that our life should look somewhat like some other storyline we find in the Bible. But the hard thing is that when we think about that, we don't actually stop and think about the details involved in that or the hardships in between. If you think of the story of David, you think, okay, I wouldn't mind being David. He was this shepherd boy who nobody knew, and then all of a sudden he has this great confidence in God and slays Goliath, and people are celebrating who he is, and then the next thing you know, David's the king. Yet there's an incredible period of time in between where David's confidence is tested yet again, right? And I just kind of wish, as I was studying through this week, I was hoping that I could just say, okay, so you just need to, the Christian life looks like this. You need to find the confidence in God, and once you're confident in God, you'll be confident enough, and that's like the level of confidence that you just need to arrive at. Right, so just be confident in God, and that level of confidence will be sufficient. But we see in David's life that God's, even like, so this is a man of an absolutely unshakable faith in God and his confidence. That's what, and God in his faithfulness. That's what we see as he slays that giant. But here's another example where his confidence is going to be tested even further. And the purpose of God's testing here in David's life is pretty crazy. It's for him to be more confident in God. A confident man in God, a man after his own heart, is going to need to learn to be more dependent on who God is. And I hope that that's an encouragement for you as we go through this story, because it's kind of like, I don't know about you, but my faith, I'm always trying to get to this spot where I'm like, I made it. I'm finally a person that just trusts in God. Now I'm good to go. And it seems like I get to these moments where I'm like, okay, God, I can trust you with this situation in my life, and I'm so glad that you gave me the strength to walk through that valley, and I'm kind of going up this peak again, and then all of a sudden I realize this next issue or next pathway that God takes me down, I'm like, wow, I don't know what I'm going to do now. I was confident in God a week ago, but now this new situation arises, and what am I going to do? And so I hope you feel in company with David as we go through this story. And so where we left it off last week was that David had slain Goliath. He grabbed that smooth stone, he slung it in his sling, he slays this 9'9" giant. We saw how big Goliath would have been. He falls tumbling to the ground, and then David runs up. And this is like, there's going to be a couple graphic moments here, so I'm sorry, this is just how the Bible says it. But David ran up, he grabs Goliath's sword, and he cuts off his head, because he was dead before, but he's for sure dead when his head's not attached to his body, all right? So David's dead, and the Philistines and David the Israelites and David start pursuing the Philistines. There's this tremendous victory. The dust of the battle starts to settle, and Saul's like, I'd like to see David. I'd like to get to know him a little bit better. It's kind of interesting because it's a little bit confusing, but it seems like even before this that David actually was serving Saul, playing the harp in order to help Saul through some difficult moments. So although Saul would have had a lot of employees, and a young boy playing a harp wouldn't have been high up on his priority list. All right, so the dust settles, and Saul goes, I want to meet David. I like to spend some time talking to this guy who just slayed Goliath, who I was way too afraid of. And so he sends the commander of the army, Abner, out to go get David. And so in comes David in his typical David style, and in one of David's hand is the head of Goliath, which is like, I don't know why you carry that around. That's weird, okay? So he's holding Goliath's head, which would have been heavy, in his hand, and he's talking to Saul. And Saul decides that he's going to change David's direction and his profession. He's going to make him this military leader over the people of Israel. And so it says this in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. And so Saul's a smart guy. He sees here's a warrior, a man who clearly is brave enough and wise enough to lead God's people. And so I'm going to put him in charge of the army alongside Abner. So he was like a commander in the army. And everywhere that Saul sent David, David was successful. You can imagine, I'm like not naturally a brave person by any stretch of the imaginations, which is why I'm not in the military, okay, among other reasons. But you can imagine how difficult it must be sometimes standing on a battle line, going out, not knowing if you're going to make it home at the end of that day. That would have been difficult, but you can imagine how the attitude and morale of the soldiers would have changed if leading that charge is David. Right? You're going out to war and you're thinking, I don't know about this, but David's here, and if David's here, we're probably going to be okay. David is an incredible warrior who was constantly confident in God, and so I'm ready to go out and fight this morning. And so again and again they go out, and David's victorious. And as a result of that, these mighty warriors start to flock to David as the army grows. And so just to understand how incredible some of these warriors are, I want to highlight a couple of them for you. One, because it's relevant, and two, it's also just kind of cool, okay? So here's a couple people that follow David. One is, I don't know these names at all, but Jashobeam. He was a chief of David's mighty men. He famously killed 800 men with a spear. That's insane, right? I can't imagine, all right? I have a hard time wrestling with my children, okay? So here's Jashobeam. He killed 800 men with a spear. Another one is Eleazar. So the army, Israel's in this battle. The army of Israel flees, and Eleazar's like, I got this. And he just stands and he fights against this entire army to the point where he can't even let go of his sword anymore. And the Israelites realize, wow, no one's chasing us. So they go back, and all they have left to do is to loot the dead bodies because Eleazar killed everybody. All right, and there's this another guy, his name's Benai, and he killed 2 Moabite heroes, a lion in a pit in a snowy day, which is like killing a lion is complicated enough, let alone when it's slippery, okay? And he also killed an Egyptian giant with his own spear. So he runs at this guy, has a club, disarms him, takes this thing, and kills the guy. So here's these incredible warriors that were flocking to David. And so as impressive as some of these warriors are, you just need to understand that their leadership and their presence on the battlefield was nothing compared to when David was there with the men. That's the type of level that he raised to in his military career under Saul. And so you would be pretty excited to have David as part of your team, especially if you're the king. He's going out and having all these victories. So here's David. It kind of is making sense, right? David's supposed to be king. He's learning what it means to lead people. He's learning what it means to show that he's confident in God, and he's very successful in the process. And I also want to highlight some of the main things in David's relationship with Saul, because lots of times in Bible stories, it's hard to kind of read it, and the story can be like, okay, yeah, like David and Saul, they're people, then they like each other, and then they don't like each other. But it's important to understand just the type of relationship that they have. So when I'm explaining some of these things, I want you to picture in your own mind some of these relationships that you might have with other people. And just think about the confidence you have with them, the comfort that they bring you, the amount of love you have for them, the amount of love you experience from them. So keep these people in mind when we look through this relationship between David and Saul. And so first of all, Saul is David's father-in-law. We see that in 1 Samuel chapter 18, right? He marries Michal, or however you say her name, and so as a result, he's David's father-in-law, which if you have a father-in-law, there's like this love and respect and also healthy fear that you have for your father-in-law. Hopefully one day you guys get to meet my father-in-law. I love him very much, but he also scares the snot out of me, which is good. All right? And so that's you kind of understand this relationship. You just know unconditionally that your father-in-law cares for you as you just care for them, and you appreciate them and you respect them as well. He's also his best friend's dad. So just think about that. Think about your best friend as a young person, and their dad, he's like, your dad might have been your hero, and then your second hero in life is your best friend's dad. And if you didn't have a dad, it could have just been your best friend's dad. And so his best friend's dad is Saul. Jonathan is David's best friend, and so this is his dad. Additionally, as we just saw, that David is Saul's boss, right? He's the one that tells him what to do, where to go, and how he ought to conduct himself. And so Saul is David's boss. And above all of those things, Saul is David's king, right? David understood that God had a plan, but for this time in this season, this was God's anointed king. And so David understood that clearly, and so there was a deep respect for Saul that David had as king. And so Saul was his father-in-law, his dad's best friend, his boss, and his king. And so you can kind of understand, as David's rubbing shoulders with Saul, you can see again, God is using this relationship to prepare David to one day be a king. Right? What better way to learn to be a king than to spend time with the current king? That's how people have done things for generations. And so David's on this pathway to being a king. But it's really this high mountain in David's life, right? You can imagine he's newly married, people love him, he's popular, he's winning battles. And then we understand that even in every peak in life, there's often valleys. And so David's life is no exception. And so we're going to read a portion here, and I want you to again to remember this relationship that David had with Saul and realize how much this spear of betrayal would have hurt. And so 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 10, it says, "The next day an evil spirit sent from God came powerfully on Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it thinking, 'I'll pin David to the wall,' but David got away from him twice." And so you can imagine this scene. David loves Saul, that deep relationship that they have, the love and respect that David has. He's just one day sitting there trying to help Saul through a difficult time. Saul starts to go crazy. He's sitting in his own palace with his spear, and he throws it at David. And his purpose in throwing it at David wasn't to scare him, it was to kill him. And somehow, by God's grace, David evades this spear 2 different times. And so just imagine the hurt that must have been for David. Just sitting there with someone that he loved, and then for no reason, this man tries to kill you. And David's heart must have been shattered, right? It's just like, what is happening? Right? I'm faithfully serving you, Saul. I'm faithfully serving you, God. Why on earth would the king that I love try to kill me? But we understand that if we look back just a few verses. So in verse 5 of chapter 18, it says this. We read this before. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. As the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistines, the woman came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. And I just want to pause here because you need to understand that these type of celebrations when a battle finished. Because there's one of two results that would happen after a battle, and one result is you win and you celebrate. The other result is there's one of two things that happen. That army marches in and takes you as slaves, and your life went from freedom to slavery, or an army marches in and kills you all. Those were the two outcomes that normally happen. And so the celebration that's taking place here is an incredible one. It says in verse 7, as they danced, the woman sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul was furious and resented this song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but only credited me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. And so we see that the reason that Saul tries to kill David isn't because of anything wrong that David's doing. Saul just simply sees that people love David, that he understands and knows that one day David is to be king, and he just becomes so jealous to the point where he's going to consider murdering David. And this happens on multiple occasions. This starts a pursuit of Saul as he tries to kill David time and time again, which forces David into the wilderness. David goes from a person spending time in the palace commanding armies to a man hiding in caves afraid for his life. Because the man, one of the men that he loves most in this world, is trying to destroy him. And in those moments, you have to think, like, David must have thought, what on earth is God planning to do? I thought the path of my life was going the way that God had planned. Like, I'm going this way, everything seems to make sense. And then God allows this extreme difficulty in my life, and it makes me wonder, is God's plan unraveling at the seam, or does he even have a plan at all? And in those moments, it's so difficult for us to have confidence in God, isn't it? When things seem to be spiraling out of control, when we don't seem to have enough hours in the day to get done the simple things in life, we start to wonder, where is God in the middle of my heartache? Especially if that's tied together with some sort of betrayal. You might have experienced that at some point in your life, where someone that you love just all of a sudden, just stopped respecting or loving you. You see this sometimes in family relationships where parents just love on their kids, and then kids get to this super intelligent age of teenagers, and it's like, the heartbreak that must happen, right? Where it's just, I poured my whole life into you, I loved you, why are you treating me this way? What's going on? And the heartbreak that goes on in the middle of all that. And so David's path to kingship was rocked by an unexpected detour. And so the question is, how do we maintain confidence in God when life's script seems to take an unexpected turn? Right? So here's David, he's in this valley, and we want to know, when we're in these moments in our life, what should we do? What can we learn from David's life that would encourage us when we face similar things? And the first thing is this, is that we need to be confident in God's timing. One of the things we need to do in the middle of these difficult situations is to be confident in God's timing. David's life as a fugitive was not just a period of hiding, it was a profound test of timing and a season of learning here's how this, so we're going to look at this phase and how we can see this clearly. And so this testing of timing takes place. And so if you're David, you're thinking like, I don't know what God's plan is, but it's not my plan. And there's these different moments where God allows David to go through two specific circumstances where he could have changed things he could have basically expedited the process to him being king. And so the first one's found in 1 Samuel chapter 24, and I'll just paraphrase this for us. But basically, what's happening there is that David's in the cave in Gedi, and Saul's in a pretty vulnerable situation. In fact, we learn from the Bible that Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself, and when he's in the process of doing that, somehow David's able to sneak up on Saul, and he's being encouraged in these moments by his men. And you can imagine, I would be one of these guys. I'd be like, David, this is the time. Like because David's hiding in caves with his friends, and you can just imagine them whispering like, David. It's like, but they can't really whisper because Saul's going to hear them in a cave, right? You're gonna. So it's like, how I don't know if they're using like this is what in my mind when I was thinking this, it's just basically people are going like, right? It's like, this is it. Get him. This is your time. God has clearly, like, what are the chances that this guy goes to use the washroom in the cave that you're hiding in? Very slim. This must be from God, right? But that's not what David decides to do. Instead, what he does is he cuts off a piece of Saul's robe. And then the second time, there's another instance in the wilderness of Ziph. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 26. And somehow Saul and his army are sleeping so well, or David's so sneaky, that he's able to literally sneak up on Saul as he sleeps. And the same situation arises. The men are like, David, this is it. There's no, it already happened once. You didn't kill him. We're still living in regret of that moment as we continue to hide in caves. David, just this time, just end the job, right? He's literally asleep. Just put a spear through him, walk away, and we'll be good. You can be king, your life will be simple, but that's not what David does. Instead, he takes Saul's spear and his water jug. I would be taking Saul's spear too if he tried to kill me with it a bunch of times. So he takes the spear and the water jug, and he just continues to trust that God has a plan. And I love this, the difference between Saul and David. And we catch this in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 9 to 10. So let me read these for you. It says, David said to Saul, so this is the scene. This is the first situation. David could have killed Saul when he's going to the washroom. He cuts off parts of his robe, and he yells up to Saul from a distance, obviously. David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of the people who say, Look, David intends to harm you. You can see with your own eyes that the Lord has handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift my hand against my Lord's, since he is the Lord's anointed. Right? So people were whispering untrue things in Saul's ears saying, hey, David's trying to kill you. We need to find him. He's a very good warrior. He's going to sneak up when you're sleeping one day. Let's find David and let's put an end to him. And Saul's like, yes, we have to do that. The flip side of things, people are whispering in David's ear, hey, David, end Saul. And what's David's response? That's not what the Lord would want. And how could I lift my hand against the Lord's anointed? Which is interesting because who else was the Lord's anointed? David, right? David was anointed by God to become the next king. Saul knew this clearly, yet what was Saul willing to do against God's anointed plan? Do whatever he could to end that. He's like, I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to do things the way that I think makes the most amount of sense, that's easiest and best for me. I'm going to try to destroy God's plan. That's really Saul's heart here. And David's is the opposite. David understands that God has a plan, even though he doesn't understand what God's doing. And he says, how could I reach out and kill God's anointed one? And so David in this time learns what it means to trust in God's timing. For me, in those circumstances, when I have any opportunity to do things on my time schedule versus God's time schedule, I fail like 99.9% of the time because I just struggle to wait for God and his timing. I'm super one-track minded. Everything needs to get done today. And if God asks me to wait, I'm like, I'd rather die than wait. Right? God, I can't wait. We need to get things done. God, figure this thing out. God, take this situation away. God, help me to stop feeling bitter towards this person. God, make the hurt end. God, whatever you need to do it now. And I want to hurry up that process as much as I can. But there's so many times in the Christian life where God says, do you trust me? Are you confident in me? Or are you confident in yourself? And time again, we learn from David that he's a man after God's own heart. Why? Because he's confident in who God is, which means he trusts in God's timing. Another thing that we learn from David is that he's learning in this time of waiting. He's actually growing in his relationship with the Lord in the middle of this difficult season. Many of the Psalms that we have, and we'll read through a couple shortly, many of the Psalms that we have were what David wrote while he was in this time in the wilderness, when he was struggling with understanding why God allows the evil to prosper and the righteous to seem like they're being trampled all the time. He doesn't understand why things just seem so unjust if God is a just God. All these difficult questions that David contemplated, he wrote down in Psalms, which always end with praising God for who he is, that he is the refuge, that he is his strength. Can you imagine how hard it would be as a believer without the Psalms? If there weren't ways for us to just to read those and be comforted and realize, I'm not crazy. Right? Life is difficult. I can praise God and worship him even in these seasons. And so God uses this time in David's life to teach him to continue to wait and to trust in him. And in the meantime, he's writing these Psalms. He also teaches them how to be a leader in this situation of an unlikely group of people. In 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 to 2, it's like David's kind of hiding in a cave, and God brings basically all the rough people, I don't know how it's a nice way to say it, the rough people around David's life to start forming David's little group of people, and he has to learn how to lead this group of people. God's using this time of difficulty to continue to teach him how to lead, which is going to prepare him for his days when he sits on the throne. And in the middle of all this, even in the midst of chaos, we constantly see that David is seeking God's guidance. One example of that is in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 2 to 4. We won't read that, but what happens is they're trying to decide if they're going to go fight this Philistine army, and there's competing opinions on that. And what does David do? He's like, okay, let's stop. Let's take this to God first. Right? And so we see again him just exercising time and time again just a trust and a confidence in who God is. And so this teaches us the importance of seeking God's will before our own actions. Seeking God's will before our own actions. We should pause, pray, and listen for God's directions, trusting that his timing will bring about the best outcome. David's life on the run wasn't a detour in God's plan, but an integral part of it. Sometimes the detours that God allows in our life are his perfect will for our lives. It doesn't feel that way, but God uses that. His confidence in God's timing wasn't a passive resignation, but active faith. Learning and preparation were part of that. This part of his journey invites us to consider how we can patiently trust in God's schedule, using the waiting as a time for personal growth, for deepening our relationship with God, and for preparing for the roles he has for us. That's the last thing on my mind in seasons of waiting where I'm struggling to be confident in God. It's like, hey, God, I'm really excited to be in this season of my life where I don't know what you're doing and I don't know if you're in control. I just pray that you would help me grow. I'm like, God, just get me out. God, just get me out of this today. But that's not what we ought to do. We need to use those moments. God allows those moments in our lives to stretch us and to grow us for his honor and for his glory. And then another thing we see is that David is also confident in God's protection. Confident in his protection when it's like, that's what is mind-boggling when, if I'm David, I'm not sleeping very often. Because I'm like, if I fall asleep, an army's going to come into this cave and I'm dead. Right? And in fact, it was like so close at one time that like literally David's wife has to like let him down out of a window, and people come in and like stab like his bed where he made it look like he was still sleeping, like close calls. And so in those moments, I'm not celebrating God's protection. I'm thinking, God, could you protect me? But not David. Right? Listen to some of the Psalms that David writes in those moments. So Psalm chapter 63 says the following. It says, starting in verse 6, when I think of you as I lie on my bed, which is good because you're scared because you might die, I meditate on you during the night watches because you are my helper. I will rejoice in the shadow of your wings. I will follow close to me. Your right hand holds me. You understand David's heart in the middle of a time where it seemed like God was so far away? How did David interpret that? God, your wings are around me. God, you have your arm around me. God, I understand that I'm close to you and you're the one guiding me, even though I don't see where things are going. I don't understand what you're doing, but my trust, my confidence is you. Again, in Psalm chapter 18, verse 1, it says, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, where I seek refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I was saved from my enemies. In verse 30, God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is pure. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is a rock? Only our God. David understood that in these moments where the foundation of his faith was shaken, that the only place he could put his trust was in the rock, his fortress, his stronghold. Where he ran to in those moments was God. That's such a powerful lesson for us to take away. Where do we turn in our times of trouble? Where do you turn? We need to realize that there's a place to go. There's so many times in those moments for me where I'm waiting on God, I'm trying to trust in his timing, and I'm thinking, like, now where do I go? I'm just sitting here alone, and it feels like I'm in a cave. I don't know where to turn. I don't know what to do. I don't know where you are, God. And the reminder is this: who is our rock? Who is the rock? And the answer is only our God. And so it encourages us to live in God's protection, no matter what's going on in our life. And we do that by seeking God's presence. If you're wondering where God is in your life, if you're in a season of waiting or you're feeling alone, it's important for us to spend time in God's presence. As we do that, we realize that he's here, right? It's insane in my personal walk with the Lord that I act so ignorantly. It's as if like God isn't around, right? It's like, God, where are you? It's like he's literally everywhere. He's omnipresent. He's at all places. And I'm like, God, could you show up? It's as ridiculous as me sitting in my office and having someone there and wishing they were there with me. And be like, oh, I just wish I could spend more time with Carla, and she was sitting here beside me in my office, and she's like sitting there beside me in my office. That's insane, right? Why would I not just be like, thank you? This is exactly what I need in this moment. I'm so glad that you're here. Let's spend some time in courage together. And so we need to seek God's presence. He's there. We need to seek God's promises. We need to spend time in his word and to understand, maybe pray some of these prayers that David did and ask God to be our refuge and to understand that he's in control. And then we need to remember God's track record. Right? He's faithful. He's always faithful, and he'll continue to be faithful. In the shadow of his wings, in the fortress of his love, we can rest assured, not because danger is absent, but because his presence is our ultimate guard. That doesn't mean that we're not in difficult situations. It just means that in those situations, God is with us. And so we need to be confident in these promises. But sometimes that's difficult to do. And even for a man like David, who has this incredible confidence in God from slaying giants, he's writing psalms and praises to God as he's in his solitude in some cave, fearing for his life. Even David himself needed to be encouraged at times. And we see this in 1 Samuel chapter 23 with his relationship with Jonathan. It says this in verse 15. David was in the wilderness of Ziph in Horish when he saw that Saul had come to take his life. Then Saul's son Jonathan came to David in Horish and encouraged him in his faith in God. There are times in our life where we just need someone to come along and to encourage us in our faith in God. He said, "Don't be afraid, for my father Saul will never lay a hand on you. You yourself will be king over Israel, and I will be your second in command. Even my father Saul knows this is true." And so David just needed encouraged. He needed to be reminded of the promises of God, that God was faithful. He needed someone to come alongside him and to keep him on track. And so I would just encourage you that if you need encouragement, just seek out a Jonathan. Find someone who can not just come and give you all the answers, just sit down and encourage you and remind you that God is with you, that you're not alone. And I also encourage you that maybe there's someone in your life someone in your life that you need to come along and be a Jonathan for, just to encourage and to strengthen. And so the reasons for David's confidence in God in the middle of these difficult situations were these. He trusted in God's timing, he trusted in God's protection, and he trusted and was encouraged by Jonathan in God's promises as we were reminded of God's faithfulness. And so when our lives take unexpected turns and our plans unravel, let us learn from David's journey to discern God's plan by trusting in God's timing, protection, and promises. Embrace the detours and delays as part of God's divine plan for growth and preparation. And like David, do these following things. So seek wisdom in waiting. Instead of fighting against the timing, find the lesson or the growth opportunity within it. Develop patience, deepen your faith, and lead through your circumstances. And so in those times, seek wisdom in the waiting. Find strength in God's protection. In times of vulnerability, let our confidence be in God's ability to shield you from harm, not in your own defenses or solution. Rest in his presence as your fortress. Hold fast to God's promises. When fulfillment seems distant, anchor yourself to the unchanging promises of God. Let his word be your guide and your hope, reinforcing the assurance that his faithfulness is your surety. When what felt to David like God's plan falling apart was actually God masterfully working behind the scenes, preparing David to be the king by molding his heart to be even more confident in him. And that's what God does in those seasons in our life as well. God's trying to mold us into people who are more confident in him. And so let us embrace our own unexpected journeys with the same trust, knowing that even the twists in our life are part of God's grand design to bring us to our appointed place, not by our map, but by his. And so I just need to be reminded, and I want to encourage you this morning, that the Christian life is not about living life according to my plans and according to my desires. It's about living life according to God's plan and God's desires. And so when we're in those situations where we're struggling to see the pathway forward, I would just encourage you to trust in God's timing, to trust in God's protection, and to trust in God's promises, and seek to honor and glorify him in the middle of whatever you're going through. And so let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for this time. I thank you for the awesome opportunity we have to just learn and to grow and to encourage one another. God, if there's someone here this morning who feels like they're in a wilderness situation in their life where they've maybe felt betrayed or disheartened, God, I pray that you would encourage them. Lord, I pray that you would help us in those times to take our focus off of ourselves and to ask, God, what are you trying to teach us? What can we learn in those moments? And God, I pray that you would impress those on our hearts to encourage us, to strengthen us, to grow us for your honor and for your glory. And Lord, I also pray that in those times we would just remember your promises. Lord, the things that we know are true according to your word. And one of those promises is that you are our refuge. And so God, I pray that you would be the one we run to, whatever comes our way. In your precious and holy name we pray. Amen.